For more than half a decade, British billionaire playboy Sir Richard Branson's Virgin Group has been conquering the world of music, air travel, communications, and even soft drinks. It's not that everything he touches turns to gold, but he has the ability to spot talent in others, and he's nurtured numerous talented artists who might otherwise have never been discovered. The 71-year-old famously pipped fellow billionaire Jeff Bezos in his quest to be the first billionaire in outer space in 2021, despite being worth much less than his bald-headed rival. So how did Richard Branson rise from relative obscurity into the owner of one of the most recognizable brands on the planet? Just how big is the Virgin Group empire, and what are the eccentric magnate's plans for the future? Let's find out. Richard Branson's always had an eye for extravagant promotion. The flamboyant billionaire has a long list of very wild and wonderful public stunts. He famously appeared in public dressed in a $10,000 white silk bridal gown, drove a tank into New York City's Times Square, and fired a cannon at the Coca-Cola sign. He even put the Sex Pistols on a boat and sailed down the Thames River just so they could loudly play God Save the Queen outside the House of Commons, a song the British government has banned from being played on the radio. Furthermore, he made several attempts to circumnavigate the globe by balloon. Do these sound like the antics of a sane entrepreneur? Well, maybe you need to be a little crazy to manage the levels of success Sir Richard Branson has achieved in his 71 years so far. So where does this story all start? Richard Charles Nicholas Branson was born on July 18, 1950 in Blackheath, London. His father, Edward James Branson, was a barrister, while his mother, Yvette, was a former ballet dancer turned flight attendant. As a child, Richard struggled with dyslexia, which made keeping up with school difficult. His grades were so poor, he nearly failed out of the all-boys Cutcliffe Prep School. By the age of 13, Branson transferred to Stowe School, a boarding school in the northeast of London in Buckinghamshire, England. However, the change of scenery wasn't enough to keep him interested in school. So, at the tender age of 16, Branson quit school and found the company that started it all. In 1966, 16-year-old Richard Branson and his friend Nick Powell launched a magazine called Student. It was supposed to be this counterculture publication and a voice for young activists, despite Branson managing to sell over $8,000 worth of advertising space in the first publication. By 1968, the first publication of Student was completed with 50,000 copies ready to start handing out for free. On the same day Student launched, Branson would receive a letter from his old headmaster at Stowe that said, "Congratulations, Branson. I predict you will either go to prison or become a millionaire." Ironically, he'd end up doing both. While Student was popular, it wasn't as profitable as Branson had hoped, and the young future entrepreneur soon started looking for other opportunities. By 1969, Branson was living in a London commune, surrounded by members of the infamous British music and drug scene. It was with this wild backdrop that Richard hit upon the idea of selling records through the mail at discounted prices. People credit Bezos with revolutionizing home shopping, but Branson was already doing it in the swinging 60s. Branson ran ads for his mail-order record business in publications of Student, and within a few issues, his side hustle became more lucrative than the magazine. In fact, the mail-order business grew to the point where it was propping up the money-hemorrhaging magazine. Sensing a boom, Branson rented an empty shop above a shoe store on Oxford Street in London. He put up a few shelves, recruited the staff of Student as employees, and opened a discount record store. When trying to choose a name, Richard settled on Virgin, mostly because everyone involved was a complete virgin at business. Virgin was, again, moderately successful, but Branson would always struggle with a lack of capital funds, making any kind of expansion really difficult. Strapped for cash, Branson devised a scheme to avoid paying sales tax. However, the scam was uncovered, and Branson was arrested and jailed. He was luckily able to somehow arrange an out-of-court settlement, agreeing to pay back the taxes over the next 3 years. It wouldn't be Branson's last brush with tax law, but it did wisen him up to start keeping much better records. By 1972, Branson had grown Virgin to a chain of record stores in over 14 locations. With profits beginning to add up, Richard finally had the money to build his very own recording studio in Oxfordshire. Virgin Records, not to be confused with the Virgin Records stores, launched in 1972, and in 1973 they signed their first artist, Mike Oldfield. Oldfield would go on to release the instrumental album named Jubilee Bells. While slowly received at first, Jubilee Bells would receive worldwide notoriety after its opening sequence was used in the soundtrack for the 1973 horror film The Exorcist. The chilling instrumental would go on to become a worldwide hit, selling over 15 million copies to date. Business was good, but it was about to get a whole lot better. In 1977, against all advice, Branson signed an outlandish punk rock band called the Sex Pistols. They'd already been dropped from 2 other record labels within the last 6 months because of their drunken and scandalous antics on and off the stage. In fact, their last deal with A&M had only lasted 6 days before the contract was torn up. And it was this disagreement that led Branson to orchestrate one of the many extremely public promotions. The band had recorded only one song with A&M, their version of God Save the Queen, and 25,000 copies had already been pressed, ready for distribution. When A&M tore up their contract, they also destroyed virtually every copy of the recording ever made, and through vicious threats of litigation, prevented that version of the song from being played on the radio. Branson swooped in, signing the Pistols to Virgin Records and getting to work on re-recording the infamous single. On June 7, 1977, the Queen was busy in preparation for her Silver Jubilee celebrations. At the other end of the Thames, Branson and the Sex Pistols were about to cause anarchy in the UK. Hiring a boat and sailing down the river at full volume, Branson and the Sex Pistols crashed the Jubilee, all while screaming, "God Save the Queen." Police very quickly stormed the boat, assaulting the Pistols' manager and arresting everyone involved. But all that attention just fueled flames onto the Sex Pistols single, and sales went through the roof. They had cemented their place in rock and roll royalty, and had made Virgin Records a household name in the process. While the Sex Pistols would self-destruct shortly afterward, Virgin Records went from strength to strength, quickly becoming the world's largest independent record label. It boasted a rotation of artists that included the Rolling Stones, Peter Gabriel, UB40, and Paula Abdul. By 1983, Richard Branson's empire was made up of more than 50 companies, everything from film production to air conditioning. It was only in the early 80s, and already Branson's Virgin brand was generating combined sales of more than $17 million per year. Despite his very quickly escalating wealth, Branson has maintained that his motivation isn't financial. Instead, he enjoys the challenge of trying to do something better than other people. So in 1984, Branson decided to try and shake up the world of airline travel. Just like his decision with the Sex Pistols, Branson was very heavily advised against launching Virgin Atlantic. In fact, many of Branson's colleagues went on record saying he was crazy for even considering it. A new transatlantic airline would mean going up against British Airways, which had only very recently crushed a competitor who tried to enter the highly lucrative British market. But just like before, Richard stuck to his guns, convinced he could create an affordable and enjoyable experience to rival not only British Airways, but other international carriers as well. The initial response to Virgin Atlantic was almost fever pitch. The airline became famous for its superior service and lavish amenities, which included in-flight massages, hydrotherapy baths, free ice cream during movies, and video screens on the back of seats in every class. But as the hype wore off, as the 90s rolled around, life in the air started to become expensive. Economies around the world were in recession, the price of airline fuel had more than doubled, and to make matters worse, in 1991, British Airways launched a smear campaign to drive Branson out of business. As a result, Branson sued British Airways for libel, settling out of court for $945,000 in damages, which Branson distributed to his staff as a Christmas bonus. Despite the one-off bailout, by 1992, Virgin Atlantic's financial situation was so dire that Branson's creditors forced him to sell Virgin Records to Thorn EMI to keep the airline flying. The sale would raise a little over $1 billion and would be enough for Branson to both pay off the bank and own Virgin Atlantic outright. Branson was crushed by the loss, reportedly crying after the contract was signed. He had loved the music company he'd built from the ground up, and he vowed never again to put himself at the mercy of bank lenders. He was also determined to stay in the music business, and that would become a big part of the next chapter of Richard Branson's story. Still reeling from the loss of Virgin Records, Richard Branson developed a new business approach, one which he called branded venture capital. This remarkable strategy enabled Branson to launch a network of seemingly unrelated businesses with minimal investment and high ownership percentage. The key to this strategy lies in licensing the Virgin brand, monetizing that familiarity and trust the Virgin name has built in. In the Virgin Group model, Branson manages the business and supplies the Virgin name in exchange for a controlling interest. Investors and franchisees front the investment capital, while Branson sits back and reaps the rewards. As a result of this strategy, Branson now owns or holds interests in more than 200 different companies. Special mention should be made of Virgin Interactive, which was founded as Virgin Games in 1983. This company distributed, among others, the two PC game classics Dune and Dune 2, which made real-time strategy games respectable. There was also a half-baked attempt to invade the lucrative soft drink market with their Coca-Cola rival, Virgin Cola. On blind taste tests, Branson found kids preferred his version of the popular cola drink, beating both Coke and Pepsi. This was all the encouragement Branson needed, and in 1994, Virgin Cola was launched. In true Richard Branson style, the launch of Virgin Cola included a big public stunt, dripping with obnoxious showmanship. Richard Branson drove a tank through Times Square, running over 3 tons of stacked Coca-Cola cans, pretending to fire a gun at the Coca-Cola sign, which had been wired with explosives the night before to make it look like it had actually blown up. Despite the stunt, Coca-Cola ramped up its pressure on retailers, supplying them with drinks fridges in return for not stocking Virgin Cola, fading the drink into obscurity by the end of the 90s with only a few locations supplying the drink. By the late 2000s, it had ceased manufacture altogether. Today, the Virgin Group is worth around $23 billion, with Branson stepping down as chairman in 2009. Even though he's walked away from management, he still owns controlling shares in almost every one of the Virgin companies, giving him an intimidating net worth of around $5 billion. All of these business achievements led to a very prestigious honor being presented to Branson in 2000. In March of 2000, Richard Branson, now Sir Richard Branson, was knighted by Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, in an investiture ceremony at Buckingham Palace. He was commended for services to entrepreneurship. When asked by reporters how it felt to be Sir Richard, he replied in typical Branson fashion, "It feels great. It feels odd sleeping with a lady though." Virgin Galactic. Richard Branson was never satisfied with just traveling around the globe. There were Virgin Rail Group, Virgin Airways, Virgin Hyperloop, Virgin Voyages, even Virgin Balloon flights. But there was one realm he hadn't conquered yet: space. Virgin Galactic was founded in 2004 with 2 missions in mind: the development of commercial spacecraft and the chartering of suborbital space flights to space tourists. After Burt Rutan's Spaceship One design won the first private crewed spaceflight at the Ansari X Prize in 2004, Branson partnered with Rutan's company, Scaled Composites, to form the Spaceship Company, which set to work developing a suborbital spaceplane. In April 2013, the project made an impressive leap forward with the test launch of Spaceship Two. Branson was delighted by the success of his spaceship's first test, with the craft breaking the sound barrier on its very first flight. By April 2013, more than 500 people had reserved tickets to ride on a Virgin Galactic spaceship. Unfortunately, a little over 12 months later, the first Spaceship Two, named the VSS Enterprise, crashed, killing the pilot on board. The accident caused a rethink of the design, resulting in the creation of the VSS Unity. On July the 11th, 2021, Richard Branson took off in the VSS Unity, reaching the edge of space at 86 kilometers above the Earth, making him the first billionaire founder of a space company to do so. In true billionaire troll style, Branson pipped Jeff Bezos by 9 days, absolutely on purpose, cramming a decade's worth of planning into just a few weeks in order to one-up his rival. What's next for Virgin Galactic? It's advertising taking chartered flights by 2022. Sir Richard Branson was never about the money alone. He wanted to make the world a better place and simply have fun in the process. More than once, he had to cope with setbacks or unfair business practices of competitors. But with his successes, his books, and his sometimes shrill appearances, he's inspired many more people. We can only wonder, With space conquered, when do we get Virgin Lunar Airlines?